grave, thinking he belongs at this table.
The most painful betrayal is not always from our enemies, but from those who smile and laugh with us at the same table. Have you ever experienced that moment when someone you thought was beneath you suddenly rises to a position where your entire fate rests in their hands? The sickening realization that your casual cruelty has sealed your downfall? The warm Virginia summer of 1851 draped itself heavily over Oakwood Plantation like a wet blanket, the cicadas singing their endless chorus as the setting sun cast long shadows across the manicured gardens. Inside the grand manor house, candlelight flickered across fine china and crystal glasses, illuminating the faces of the wealthy and privileged as they gathered for one of the most anticipated dinner parties of the season. The air hung thick with the scent of roasted meats, freshly baked bread, and the sweet perfume of the ladies mingling with the underlying mustiness that no amount of cleaning could ever quite remove from these old southern homes. Solomon Wright stood silently against the wall, his face a perfect mask of servitude, betraying nothing of the sharp intelligence behind his deep brown eyes. At 35 years old, his strong hands showed the marks of a lifetime of labor, but his posture remained dignified despite the simple, clean clothing that marked him as property of Judge William Harrison, the aging master of Oakwood. Unlike the field hands who rarely saw the inside of the main house, Solomon served as the judge's personal attendant, privy to conversations most slaves would never hear. His light complexion, the result of a lineage no one openly discussed, made some guests uncomfortable, especially when they noticed the striking similarity between his features and those of the elderly judge. Judge Harrison sat at the head of the table, his once imposing frame now slightly stooped with age, his white hair thinning but still meticulously combed. At 73, he had outlived 2 wives and, most tragically, all 3 of his legitimate children. His niece, Miss Eleanor Beaumont, had moved into Oakwood 5 years prior, after the death of his last son, ostensibly to care for her aging uncle. With her delicate features, carefully arranged golden curls, and seemingly sweet disposition, she had quickly become the darling of local society, and many speculated she would inherit the substantial Harrison estate, one of the most prosperous in the county. Eleanor lifted her glass, the candlelight catching in the crystal and casting prism patterns across the white tablecloth. She laughed melodiously at something whispered by Charles Whitmore, the young lawyer who had been courting her with increasing ardor in recent months. Charles represented everything the Southern aristocracy valued most: handsome, educated at the finest northern universities, and from one of the oldest families in Richmond. Their marriage would consolidate 2 of the most influential families in Virginia society. It was during the serving of the second course that the moment occurred, which would set in motion the events that would change everything at Oakwood. Solomon stepped forward to refill the judge's water glass, moving with the practiced grace of someone trained to be invisible. As he leaned between Eleanor and the judge, his elbow accidentally brushed against Eleanor's lace sleeve, causing her to flinch dramatically as though touched by something unclean. "Oh my," she exclaimed, loud enough to momentarily halt all conversation at the table. "I do believe your servant needs remedial training, Uncle, or perhaps a reminder of his place with a few lashes." Her voice dripped with honeyed venom as she made a show of brushing at her sleeve. The table fell uncomfortably silent. Judge Harrison frowned slightly but said nothing, his rheumy eyes briefly meeting Solomon's before looking away. Solomon himself remained expressionless, though something flickered briefly in the depths of his gaze before he stepped back against the wall. What no one at the table could see was the careful way his fingers curled into his palm, the only external sign of the burning humiliation and rage that coursed through him. Eleanor, apparently encouraged by her uncle's silence, continued, "Though I suppose we must make allowances. They say the judge has been far too lenient with this one. Some even whisper he can read, though of course that would be entirely inappropriate and against the law." She smiled sweetly, her eyes cold as they flickered to Solomon. Solomon had indeed been taught to read and write by the judge himself, a secret known only to the 2 of them. For 15 years, Solomon had served not only as a body servant but as a confidant, and even an unofficial legal assistant, his keen mind absorbing the intricacies of the law from the numerous discussions he had been present for and the books he had been secretly permitted to study late at night. The judge, with no surviving sons to mentor, had found in Solomon an eager and brilliant student, though one whose potential could never be publicly acknowledged in the world they inhabited. What no one at that table knew, not even Solomon himself, was that 3 days prior, Judge Harrison had visited his lawyer in Richmond and made a dramatic change to his will. Years of observing his niece's calculating nature and growing evidence of her cruel treatment of the household slaves when he wasn't present had convinced him she was not the worthy heir he had hoped for. Instead, he had made the extraordinary decision to free Solomon upon his death and, even more shocking, to leave him a substantial portion of his estate, including a property in Ohio, where Solomon could live as a free man. The remainder would go to an abolitionist society, with only a modest stipend for Eleanor. I need to pause this story for a moment to ask you directly. When was the last time you trusted someone and felt that stab in your chest, that silent warning that something wasn't right? I know you may never have shared this with anyone. It's that pain we keep thinking no one will understand. But here, in this space we're creating together, your experience matters. If you felt this silent betrayal, leave in the comments just the words, "I recognize this feeling," and see how many people share this invisible wound. Your comment could be the first step for someone to realize they're not alone on this journey. Let's continue the story now, but carrying this reflection with us. In the weeks following the dinner party, tensions at Oakwood grew. Eleanor, emboldened by what she perceived as her uncle's tacit support of her behavior, became increasingly cruel to Solomon, assigning him demeaning tasks beneath his position and finding small ways to humiliate him when the judge wasn't present. Solomon endured it all with outward stoicism, but inside, his resolve hardened. He began to plan for a future he had never dared dream of before freedom, perhaps even in a northern state where he could use his secret knowledge of the law. What Solomon didn't know was that Eleanor harbored suspicions about his unusual position in the household. Late one night, she discovered him in the judge's library, a book of legal statutes open before him. Rather than exposing him immediately, she began to form a plan of her own. She would use this forbidden knowledge as leverage when the time was right, either to have him sold away from Oakwood, or perhaps even charged with a crime that would see him severely punished. Charles Whitmore became an unwitting pawn in this quiet battle of wills. Eleanor convinced him that Solomon was a dangerous influence on her aging uncle, perhaps even manipulating the old man in ways that could threaten her inheritance. Charles, eager to protect the interests of his future bride, began to make subtle suggestions to the judge about the wisdom of selling some of the more valuable slaves before his health declined further, to ensure they didn't become problematic during a transition of ownership. Judge Harrison, however, was not as oblivious as Eleanor believed. Despite his advancing age and occasionally faltering health, his mind remained sharp. He observed the changing dynamics in his household with growing concern. One evening, after experiencing chest pains that left him briefly bedridden, he called Solomon to his chambers and, in a moment of unprecedented candor, revealed his plans. "Solomon, there are papers in my desk that concern your future. My lawyer holds copies. When I am gone, you must go to him immediately. There are those who would prevent you from receiving what I have designated for you." The old man's voice was weak but determined. Solomon stood frozen in shock, unable to fully comprehend what his master was suggesting. "Master, I don't understand," he finally managed to say, forgetting in his confusion the proper formality. The judge smiled faintly. "You will, but you must be careful. There are currents moving against you." The look in his eyes conveyed what he could not safely say aloud, that Solomon would face dangerous opposition to his freedom and inheritance. That night, as Solomon lay awake trying to make sense of the judge's cryptic words, Eleanor was engaged in her own clandestine activity. Having observed the private meeting between her uncle and the slave, her suspicions reached a fever pitch. She slipped into the judge's study and began methodically searching through his papers, looking for anything that might reveal what hold Solomon seemed to have over the old man. What she discovered in a locked drawer nearly stopped her heart: a newly drafted will, dated just after the dinner party, that would leave her with almost nothing while granting freedom and a fortune to a slave. The realization that her years of calculated patience might result in watching her uncle's estate pass to someone she considered beneath contempt drove her to a cold fury. She carefully returned the document, her mind racing with desperate plans. The following morning, Eleanor composed a letter to Charles asking him to come urgently to Oakwood. When he arrived, she presented a carefully crafted tale, weeping delicately as she claimed to have discovered Solomon stealing valuable documents from her uncle's office, perhaps even forging papers that could be used after the judge's death. Charles, seeing an opportunity to prove his devotion to Eleanor and protect her interests, promised to handle the matter discreetly. 2 days later, Judge Harrison suffered a severe stroke that left him bedridden and unable to speak. Though his eyes remained alert and often followed Solomon around the room with evident concern, the household held its breath, waiting for what seemed inevitable. As a parade of doctors came and went with grim expressions, Eleanor wasted no time. With the judge incapacitated and unable to interfere, she instructed Charles to bring accusations against Solomon, claiming he had been caught attempting to steal valuable items in preparation for an escape. It was a serious charge that could result in the severest punishment, possibly even execution in a society paranoid about slave rebellions. Solomon found himself suddenly clapped in irons and confined to the small jail in town. Bewildered by the speed of his fall from relative privilege to condemned prisoner, the evidence against him was entirely fabricated, but in a society structured to protect white interests above all, his denial carried little weight. As he sat in his cell awaiting a hurried trial, he remembered the judge's words about papers that could secure his future, papers now completely beyond his reach. What Solomon could not know was that Judge Harrison, though unable to speak, was fighting his own desperate battle from his sickbed. Seeing through Eleanor's scheme but unable to voice his objections, he managed through great effort to communicate to his longtime personal physician his desire to see his lawyer. The physician, one of the few people who suspected the true nature of Solomon's relationship to the judge, reluctantly agreed to carry the message, despite Eleanor's insistence that her uncle was too ill for visitors. The unexpected arrival of Mr. Pemberton, the judge's lawyer of 30 years, threw Eleanor's carefully orchestrated plans into disarray. She attempted to prevent him from seeing her uncle alone, but the lawyer insisted on professional privilege. In the judge's chamber, Pemberton was shocked by his old friend's deteriorated condition, but recognized the desperate intelligence still burning in his eyes. Through a laborious system of eye movements and barely perceptible nods, the judge made Pemberton understand that Solomon had been falsely accused, and that the new will must be executed immediately. Pemberton, though disturbed by the unorthodox bequest to a slave, was nevertheless bound by his professional ethics to carry out his client's wishes. The scene that unfolded the next day in the town courthouse would be recalled for generations, as Solomon stood before the hastily assembled hearing, expecting to be railroaded toward a predetermined guilty verdict. The doors opened to admit Mr. Pemberton, accompanied by the county sheriff and 2 additional lawyers from Richmond. Eleanor sat near the front, her expression confident beside Charles, certain that her machinations would soon be rewarded with Solomon's punishment and removal. Mr. Pemberton approached the bench and presented documents that caused the presiding magistrate's eyebrows to rise dramatically. After a hushed conference, the magistrate cleared his throat uncomfortably and addressed the crowded room. These proceedings are hereby suspended. New evidence has been presented that bears directly on the status of the accused. Judge Harrison, though currently incapacitated, had previously executed legal documents that impact this case significantly. Eleanor rose to her feet, her face flushing with anger. Whatever papers are being presented, they cannot possibly supersede the testimony of family regarding this slave's criminal behavior, she declared, her voice ringing with the confidence of someone who had never been contradicted in public. The magistrate fixed her with a cold stare. Miss Beaumont, these papers include a sworn affidavit from Judge Harrison dated 2 weeks ago, indicating his suspicion that false charges might be brought against his servant Solomon in an attempt to prevent the execution of his will. Additionally, Mr. Pemberton has presented the legally executed will itself, which grants freedom to Solomon Wright, along with a substantial inheritance. A collective gasp swept through the courtroom. Such an arrangement was nearly unprecedented in Virginia society. Eleanor swayed slightly, her face draining of color as her carefully constructed future crumbled before her. Charles stepped away from her, his legal mind quickly calculating the implications and recognizing that he wanted no part in what was clearly a fraudulent accusation. But perhaps most shocking of all was the revelation contained in a separate letter, read aloud by Mr. Pemberton at the judge's explicit instruction. In careful legal language, it acknowledged what many had long suspected but never dared speak aloud, that Solomon Wright was, in fact, Judge Harrison's natural son, born to an enslaved woman 35 years earlier. The judge had kept him close all these years, unable to acknowledge him publicly but unwilling to have him sold away as had happened to so many children of such unions. As the chains were removed from Solomon's wrists, he stood in stunned silence, the weight of his new reality slowly settling upon him. He was not only to be free but recognized, at least legally, as the judge's son and heir. The fortune that Eleanor had schemed for years to secure would pass instead to the very man she had mocked and attempted to destroy. Judge William Harrison passed away 3 days later, never regaining the ability to speak but dying with the knowledge that his son would have the freedom and opportunities he had secretly prepared him for throughout his life. Solomon, now legally Solomon Wright Harrison, honored his father by using his inheritance not only to establish himself in Ohio as planned, but also to create a foundation that would assist others escaping from slavery and fighting for education and legal rights. Eleanor Beaumont left Virginia in disgrace, the scandal of her actions following her even to distant relatives in Boston. Her engagement to Charles Whitmore dissolved as quickly as her prospects, his legal career too promising to be tainted by association with her failed plot. The modest stipend provided for her and the judges will prove her only financial support, a constant reminder of her own role in her downfall. The story of the enslaved man who became heir to one of Virginia's great fortunes circulated for years, growing with each telling. For those still in bondage, it offered a rare glimpse of justice in a world that provided precious little. For the privileged, it served as an uncomfortable reminder that the social order they took for granted was more fragile than they cared to admit, and that their treatment of those they considered beneath them might someday be remembered and accounted for. The human heart has infinite capacity for both cruelty and redemption. When Eleanor mocked Solomon at that lavish dinner party, she could not have imagined that her casual cruelty was being observed by the one person whose opinion would determine her future. She gambled everything on her ability to manipulate those around her, never considering that someone she dismissed as property might one day hold her fate in his hands. How often do we overlook the humanity in those we consider beneath us? How dangerously do we underestimate those we fail to truly see? The story of Solomon and Eleanor reminds us that true character reveals itself not in how we treat those who can benefit us, but in how we behave toward those we believe cannot harm us. Justice may move slowly, but it often arrives with a power and finality that no amount of privilege can deflect. If these stories of courage and betrayal during the slavery era touch your heart as they touch mine, I invite you to join our community. By subscribing to the channel, you'll have access to carefully researched stories that reveal long-hidden truths about our past, helping to understand wounds that still echo in our society. It's not just about knowing history, but about honoring the memory of those who lived these realities. Click subscribe and let's journey together in discovery and reflection.